Salut YouTube, comment allez-vous aujourd'hui? Today we are going to be jamming on a topic that brings a smile to my face, which are the many French words that are being used right now in the English language, just in your day-to-day conversation, dropping those French bombs here and there, which are being used completely incorrectly, or just not in a way that French people would actually use them. And this is not, a mocking conversation. This is just more like, isn't that sweet how the language has evolved kind of conversation, because it is true that over a third of the English language contains words which are actually originally derived from French. So it completely makes sense that over time, as we've evolved, the language has evolved alongside with us. However, now that I am bilingual in both languages, it does bring a smile to my face when I hear these French words used seemingly unknowingly out of context. You know that I love to geek out on language as well. So if you know of any others, please do drop them down below so that we can laugh about them together. Either French words being used incorrectly in English or English words used incorrectly in French as well. On that very topic though, I have done a couple of videos already on that. So those are quite a hoot. I'll definitely leave the links down below. You can open a new tab and check those out to watch next as well. Now, we do have the end of the year coming up. It is goal setting season. So if any of you are wanting to improve or perfect a language that you're currently working on, whether that's English, business English, French, German, or Spanish, then I have to let you know that the Lingoda Sprint is going to be open one last time for the year. And this is a very important announcement because I love Lingoda. I use Lingoda to become C1 level or fluent level in French myself. And I just think language learning is done different when it's through an online school. It's so much more flexible. You're connected to native professors all around the world at lightning speed. The group classes are nice and small. It just works on so many levels. But the reason that the Sprint itself is really exciting is that you can actually earn 100% cashback. So you can essentially get 2 months of language learning courses for free, which is insane. So when it comes to the Lingoda Sprint, you do have a couple of options. The first is the Super Sprint. So this is pretty hardcore. So this is 30 classes per month for the 2 months. And if you attend 100% of the classes, show up for yourself, get into that habit of language learning, you can earn the 100% cashback. Or if you do the Sprint, that's 15 classes per month for the 2 months, and you can earn up to a 50% cashback. I think what's really cool about the Sprint is it forces you to get it done. It makes you stick to it. It builds that habit. You show up for yourself and you get into that discipline of just getting it done. And that is why so many of my subscribers absolutely love the Sprint, because they see that increase in fluency, they see that increase in confidence, and it is that kick up the butt you sometimes do just need, especially if you've just set a goal for yourself that this year is going to be the year you become really comfortable and fluent in that chosen language of yours. So if you are curious, click the link below to learn more. You will, by clicking that link, automatically have a discount code applied, which is Rosie Winter. And what this means is that when you sign up, you will get either 20 euros or $25 US off your Sprint registration fee. Basically, in terms of cost effectiveness, habit building, confidence building, and effectiveness in terms of getting fluent really, really quickly, giving you that boost that you need, I couldn't recommend it more. And honestly, the chance to do something that you love and potentially get either half or 100% of your money back, it's pretty cool. Again, you can just check out the link below, make it your Christmas gift to yourself or a loved one this year, and happy language learning. Cool, so let's jump into these French words which are very much being used incorrectly in English. First up, we have the French word rendezvous. Rendezvous, an appointment, right? However, what I would say, and this might be a little bit of a theme throughout this video, is that it's often used in an English-speaking context as having a very dodgy or more sexual connotation, right? Like whenever they're talking about people meeting up to have an affair at a hotel, it's always a rendezvous that they're having. Like it always seems to have some sort of connotation with going on a date, being with a lover, like, oh, we've got a little rendezvous coming up. Or like we may or may have not booked our second rendezvous. Whereas in French and in France, a rendezvous is honestly just an appointment. Like in the workplace, you can make a rendezvous with a client. We're talking about rendezvous all the time and there is no connotation associated with it whatsoever. The next word that does frustrate me a little bit, I have to admit, and it is very much American English, so it's very much localized, geo-localized to the US. No offense, my Americans, but it's the use of the word entree for a main meal. Now, entree, of course, means entrance in French. So in the rest of the world, we've interpreted that to mean the starter, right? The grand entrance of the meal. But for some bizarre reason, in the US, it does mean the main meal, and that really tripped me up when I was in New York. Next up, I want to talk about the word bougie. Now, this word has been popular for a while, saying something that's bougie, it's a bit fancy, like, oh, I like those bougie candles, or oh, I really like that bougie skincare brand. And the thing is, it's coming from the French word bourgeoise or bourgeoisie, which again is interesting because it's like, just because it's a French word, it's almost as if that's interpreted to mean fancy, upper class. The bourgeoisie is actually referring to almost like a working middle class who have made money, but through hard work. So we're definitely not talking about nobility here. Now, the funny thing is that bougie in French means either a candle or a medical instrument. It's got the same name in English. So it would sound really out of place if you were referring to anything being bougie in general, let alone it being really, really fancy or a little bit upper class. Reading from a definition site here, it says, bougie all stem from bourgeoisie, a French word that simply means of middle class status. Burn. So next up, I couldn't do this video without, of course, mentioning ooh la la. Now, ooh la la, again, in English, is almost exclusively used in a cheeky kind of concept, like ooh la la, or like, oh, that's a bit cheeky, that's a bit sexy, that's a bit flirty, right? It's often, again, got those sort of naughty or romantic connotations. Whereas I can promise you, 99% of the time in France, it's either coming from a place of like frustration or anger or like impatience. If you're queuing up and it's taking forever to get through, you're like, oh la la. Or if you're looking at your emails and your colleague sent through something stupid again, like, oh la 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 la, c'est pas vrai. Or sometimes it's like a little sharp shock of surprise, like, oh la. My point is, in French, it's much more likely to be like, oh la la, than ooh la la. The next word that's used quite commonly in English is négligé, obviously referring to a nice pretty piece of lingerie, kind of nighty, silky, slinky, that kind of thing. Whereas in the actual French language, that word means négligé, something's been neglected. Apparently in certain circles or people of a certain age would know what you meant in the right context, but it's definitely not something that's commonly used. Another thing we say all the time in English is something's gourmet, like, oh, that food is so gourmet. Or wow, very gourmet, isn't it, that restaurant? Now, gourmet is never used as an adjective in French. So the word exists, gourmet, it's speaking about a sort of connoisseur when it comes to cuisine. So it's not too off the mark, it's just a noun, it's not an adjective. So they would never use the word gourmet as a describing word. They may use more so the word gastronomique. Next up, we've got touche, which is of course a French word. It comes from fencing, and of course when someone touches you in fencing, you say touche. But of course, in day-to-day meaning now, it's more around, especially in English, it's more like touche, like gotcha, like had the last word or made the last zingy comment. What I would say is that while you can use it more or less in the same context in French, touche also means to feel touched, both physically and emotionally touched. And so you've got to be careful about the context, because if someone says they were very touché by a film, for example, it means emotionally moved. Not anything to do with almost that kind of like, oh yeah, you got me, fair enough, kind of conversation thing between friends. Another word we use in English all the time, a little bit incorrectly, would be risque. It's very risque, like very sexy again, risque, naughty, a bit cheeky, maybe a bit surprising. Like if you went to a cabaret or something, you could be like, oh, it's very risque. Again, sexually charged or suggestive. In French, risque literally just means risky. A project could be risque, like anything, the most banal thing at work could be risque. It doesn't have any hint, nudge attached to it whatsoever. Now, another French term that we use in quite a strange way, and it's not just the term itself, but it's our pronunciation of it as well, cul-de-sac. So firstly, cul-de-sac, I mean, in French that would be cul-de-sac, which literally means ass of the bag. It has a wider meaning in French. It's not just about, you know, a specific kind of road where you get to the end and it's got that sort of area in which you can turn around and you come back out the other side. It really is a wider sort of colloquial way of saying a dead end. But again, literally it means the ass of a bag. I mean, to be fair, Visually, it works, right? I mean, it does work. You have to give us that. Another French word we're using all the time is au naturel, to mean in your birthday suit, naked, you know, done nature's way, essentially. Whereas the closest, I guess, translation I would say that people use au naturel for in French would be plain, like maybe plain yogurt or something. Next up, we have maître d' or maître d', which doesn't even exist in French. It's short for maître d'hôtel, so master of the hotel. Now, obviously in English, a maître d' to us would signify the head server or the person running the service at a hotel. So the concept is there, it's just the language thing, because maître d' by itself just means master of. Full stop, because you're missing the hotel part. Another French word that's in relatively common utilization in the English language is bric-a-brac, you know, meaning little bits and pieces, miscellaneous kind of items. You might find it in a sort of bric-a-brac store, in an antique store, all of that kind of thing, ornaments and whatnot. Now, although this is coming from a French origin, my French husband personally says that French people don't use that phrase whatsoever. It doesn't mean unwanted furniture and ornaments and items and things like that to him at all. If you're French and you disagree, please let me know, and let me know what region you come from in France as well, if you've heard of it. But apparently to Niels, he's like, no, it doesn't exist. Next up, I have the word facade. Now, we often use the word facade in terms of, oh, he's been putting on a facade, like he's a fake, he's putting on a mask, like tricking you in some kind of way. In French, this word is very pragmatic. It's just the facade of a house, you know, sort of the street-facing front of a house, for example. We also have a similar word for the facade of a building in English, so the French equivalent is only that. In English, we also tend to use the word boutique to maybe mean a little bit like local, a little bit fancy, upper end, but lesser known. Like, oh, there's a really cute boutique sort of gift store in my neighborhood. Or like, oh, that's a really boutique bookstore, isn't it? Whereas, of course, in French, boutique just means shop. So again, it's not an adjective, like something can't be boutique. A boutique is a shop, it's a noun. Next up is something that I encounter time and time again as a career coach, which is resume. Now, it's interesting. We've taken resume very much to mean, you know, the resume of our professional experience on a page, etc., etc. And it's funny because what's really ironic is that what that document is called in French is a CV, a curriculum vitae. So you've got the French calling it a CV and then other areas of the world calling it a resume, and they are referring to the same thing, which is that 1 to 3 pages essentially summarizing your professional history. Except the French just don't use the word resume. Why? Because for the French, a resume is a summary. It could be like the summary of a book, for example. And now my life is hard as a career coach because every time I talk about it, I have to say resume or CV, whatever you call it in your area of the world, but your resume or CV. Another word that we use from time to time in English is décolletage to refer to this area, right? The bust, the chest. Right? We talk about creams and skincare for the décolletage, and it refers to essentially like that low cut neckline of a dress, which essentially reveals a little bit of cleavage, right? She's exposing too much of her décolletage. But in French, this isn't even how you call it. I mean, it's similar, but it's décolleté. And you actually find the word décolletage in industrial sectors, for example, cutting leaves from root crops, or in more technical sectors like making screws and bolts, for example. Another thing we say all the time is double entendre. Double entendre doesn't actually mean anything in French because entendre means to hear, so means double to hear, which is something they don't say. Two similar words that they do use are double sens, so having a double sense, which is, you know, where one phrase could be interpreted 2 different ways, or one word could have 2 different meanings, or sous-entendu. So basically under the hood, if we were to translate it literally. And that's more so what we're trying to get at, I guess, when we're saying double entendre in English. We also use the word premiere for cinema or film when we are seeing something for the very first time, whereas in French, they call it l'avant-première. So before the premiere, before the first showing, before the first time. We've also stolen the French word corsage to refer to that flower we would tie to the wrist of our partner when we're going to a prom or an end of year dance or something like that. And a corsage actually means a bodice in French. However, apparently where this came from is that those flowers used to be attached to the bodice itself. So even though it doesn't actually mean that, and you don't use that word in French, that's how the language came to be. Another one is saying encore, encore at the end of a show. And the French actually say une autre, which is another. Encore does mean again or still, but it's just not actually used in that way in France at least. Apparently in French-speaking Canada, they do say encore. Another French word we use all the time incorrectly is sauté, to saute something in a pan to quickly fry it. And it's not that that's not the right verb, it's just that the way it is said in that tense, so sauté, is kind of like saying something is fried did. Another French phrase that you learn, probably the very first one, let's be honest, after bonjour, ménage à trois. Now, ménage à trois, again, I mean, if you said that to a French person, they'd know exactly what you're referring to. However, used correctly in correct French, it's actually referring to three people living together, kind of like in a throuple situation, because ménage actually means household, so a household of three. An actual French person asking another French person to, sleep with a couple of people at a time, they probably wouldn't actually use the phrase ménage à trois. They'd say, do you want to sleep together with another person? Should we make love? Faire l'amour à trois, maybe? But I'd say ménage à trois is actually very rare. Next up, I've got accoutrement, which in English refers to the military gear that a soldier would wear to a mission. So body armor, helmets, masks, and so on. Whereas in French, it actually means people who have really, really awful taste in clothing, or can even refer to a disguise. Something we also say in English is après ski, so after ski, referring to the activities that we get up to after hitting the slopes. So the social activities, the entertainment, all those things going down at the ski lodge. Whereas in French, this word actually refers to the boots or the shoes that you use to walk in snow. Next up, we have the word chateau. Now, I think to employ the word chateau in English very much has that literal translation of castle. It has to be a big castle, fortified, like a proper freaking chateau. Whereas in French itself, it actually has a much wider usage. Yes, it includes castles, but it can literally refer to someone's countryside home, anything that's a bit of a manor or sort of a mansion kind of fancy home can absolutely also be called a chateau. Lastly, we talk about a chef, so the head cook, the highly skilled in cooking, they're a culinary professional. Whereas I was really surprised to find that in French, chef actually means boss, big director, the chief of a business, for example, le chef d'entreprise. So in French, to talk about the head of the kitchen, you talk about a chef de cuisine, head of the kitchen, which means you can refer to any of your bosses as your chef in French, which obviously I found a little bit funny. I just always remembered like my big bosses just like cooking up a storm on their Excel spreadsheets or something. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot of new things about French words that we are using in English, sometimes kind of incorrectly and out of context. But hey, as I said, language is ever evolving and it happens in French too. I'd love to know what your favorite one was down below, or if you have anything to add. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching to the end, and I'll catch you next time on the Not Even French YouTube channel. À bientôt!